Thank you all for coming this evening. I'm going to call the Environmental Committee on Wednesday, April 13th, 2005 to order. The clerk, please call the roll.
Honorable Robert Willett.
Here.
Honorable Theodore DeSanto.
Present.
Honorable John Murphy. Honorable Roman Rodriguez.
Present.
Honorable Kenneth Zabrowski.
Present.
Honorable Harriet Cornell, Vice Chair.
Here.
Honorable Ellen Jaffee, Chair.
Present. Thank you. We have a very interesting agenda this evening. We're going to be discussing Roadsalt and the impact on our water supply, our drinking water, and then we will have an update on the proposed wastewater treatment facility in Ramapo. Even in the face of winter storms, we expect roads and highways to be maintained to provide safe travel conditions and the continual flow of goods and services. This requires substantial planning, training, personnel, equipment, and material resources to clear roads and streets throughout the winter. The dependency on de-icing chemicals and concern about the effects of sodium chloride, the most commonly used de-icing chemical, on our environment and water quality has increased. Automobile and highway bridge deck corrosion has also become a concern. There is ongoing research in an effort to maintain the safest roads possible in the most economical way while protecting the environment, and there has been a great deal of discussion about it. The USGS study assessing our water supply has already indicated at this early stage of their assessment that there is some issue and signs of elevated salt levels in our groundwater, and we will be hearing from our health department regarding that issue this evening as well. And Paul Heisig of the United States Geological Survey is expected to be with us in 2 weeks at our next meeting to give us an update of his assessment. So just wanted to let some of you know that and be aware of that. As part of our ongoing discussions about the quality of our drinking water, several weeks ago I had requested information from purchasing, which I did distribute to the committee, and I have another copy of it for those of you in the committee who want to take another look at it, about the chemicals used in the county for de-icing. I also began discussions with concerned residents and the Superintendent of Highway, Mr. Veznetti, and requested that he share with us the methods used by the county for road de-icing. We also will have a presentation by Mr. Dan Miller, who is a geologist for our environmental division of the health department. And we have Mr. Boyd here, who wants to discuss with us some thoughts about Roadsalt. He is a well driller, Mr. Henry Boyd. And we have as well Mr. George Potanovic, who's going to make a presentation. There are many others, I'm sure, who may have some comments, but I want to begin with Mr. Veznetti, who was so kind enough to be willing to be here this evening to discuss with us what Rockland County is doing to protect us, keep our roads safe, and our drinking water as well. Thank you, Mr. Veznetti.
Madam Chairperson, thank you very much for inviting me. I have to say that I was leaving the legislative chambers a couple of weeks ago, and Ellen Jaffee stopped me, and we had a little discussion on the use of Roadsalt, and I think what I said she found interesting, so she asked me if I'd stop in and have say a few words on this. Usually when I get asked to do something like this, and I've been asked to do it for a number of areas, for the American Public Works Association, I've presented for the University of Wisconsin, I've discussed this at Cornell Local Roads Program about 3 times, and I've participated in a number of seminars, both in Westchester, Orange, and Rockland, on the use of anti and de-icers, predominantly on the use of Roadsalt. So it's something I'm pretty familiar with, and I'm not an apologist for salt, I'll say that, but as a highway superintendent, I'd like to recognize there's a good number of highway superintendents out here, because they find this subject of great interest.
Well, on that note, let me just say that I do appreciate their presence. We have Mr. Larry Brissing from the Stony Point Highway, and Mr. Bernard Hughes also from the Rockland County Highway Department, and then we have from the Clarkstown, Wayne Ballard is from the Clarkstown Highway Department as well, and Mr. Michael Saker from the Rockland County Sewer District. I also want to note that Tom Maselli is here from the Health Department, and James Dean is also from the town of Orangetown, Superintendent of Highways. And I hope I didn't miss anybody. Mr. DeSante from United Water.
We also have representatives of the Village of Nyack, Village of South Nyack, and I asked the general foreman in charge of operations, Bernie Youth, if he'd please attend, because Bernie runs our day-to-day operations out in the field, and he's intimately familiar with our snow and ice operations. I think probably the first thing that I should point out is that I've distributed to the members of the committee a small handout. I think it's it's mostly informational. I think it's you might find everything in there very interesting. It has to do with salt in the environment and winter safety and things of that nature. But maybe if you take a look at that at your leisure, it'll give you an idea of what we deal with every day. You know, highway departments have a very interesting balancing act they have to perform. Our main function is to provide safe roads for our residents and commuters. At the same time, we have to do it in an environmentally sensitive and responsible manner. And then the third thing, that we have to do it economically. And that's always a struggle. Perhaps the one thing that I did say when we were leaving the meeting the other day is that I've been doing this for about 24 or 5 years now, and I can say unequivocally that all the professionals that we have here operating our department are sensitive to this issue. I mean, they work very hard at giving the finest service probably in the country. Rockland County, and when we leave here, I hope that you'll feel a lot more secure about what we're talking about today and about the services we all provide. Rockland County is recognized not only statewide but nationally as being a leader in seeking ways, cost-effective and environmentally sound ways of providing these services. Now, salt happens to be the most cost-effective de-icing product that we have on the market today. We have all dealt with, first, let me go back in my own personal history. I grew up here in Rockland. I remember the 40s and 50s when the truck would come by after the snowstorm, and there was a guy in the back shoveling cinders out. Now, in those days, they didn't even use salt. They used cinders, and the cinders came from the coal factories, right? From the plants that generated electricity for us all, and that's where that came from. And it was free, so that was a good thing. But as time went by, and as service demands increased, and especially in Rockland, as people moved to Rockland, certainly the level of service had to be raised. Currently, we happen to be the most automobile-dependent suburban county in the country. I think you all know that. I think all of us know that who live here. Our residents expect clean roads. For that reason, we have to do everything we can as highway superintendents to deliver what's needed. Now, when I first got into the highway business, we were using sand and salt. And that mix would change somewhat. Sometimes it was 3-to-1, sometimes 1-to-1, what have you. I remember that my very first year. I also remember that in the spring and most of the summer, we spent a good amount of our resources cleaning up the mess that it created and the dust that it created. So thank goodness we're not doing that anymore. But at that same time, we were first getting involved, and Rockland County also was one of the first counties in the state, and as I say, also in the nation, that's also got involved with liquid de-icing agents, which are additives that at that time we would add right on top of the truck. And that what they did was they actually activated the salt, and they made the salt work more effectively. And because it worked more effectively, we were able to use less salt. Now, let's switch forward to today. I can tell you that right now, Rockland County, and I'm only speaking for the county itself, is using 50% less salt than it was using 15 years ago. That's because we've educated ourselves, we've educated our employees on the proper use and application of it. I may jump back and forth a little, but it's all part of this history. Early on, we would wait till maybe 2 inches of snow got down before we went out. People didn't expect it to be removed right away, and I think everybody will agree with me. After attending many snow conferences, and there's many of the fellows here have attended the North American Snow Conference put on by APWA. There's also an Eastern States Winter Symposium where they learn and they're trained, and then we bring our personnel. What we learned is that that's not the way you do it. You don't wait till you get it, because it takes far more salt to melt down through the ice and melt the ice than if you put it down early and prevent the bond, and you can get rid of that snow and ice much faster. So by doing that, it being proactive, you're going to be more effective, and you're going to actually use less salt. And that's one of the reasons why today we're using far less salt than we did previously. When we get to anti-icers, which is another reason why we're using less salt, we started initially by pouring it on top of the stockpile and letting it trickle through, and then we put it out. Currently, our trucks are equipped with saddle tanks or tanks on board, and we actually apply that to the salt as it's coming out of the rear of the machine, reducing the amount of liquid chemical we add, but also activating the salt right at the spot where it's going down. So that's a positive, very positive, proactive approach. We go out as soon as it starts to snow, excuse me, and we make our applications as soon as we can. In the old days, they'd continue to keep applying and keep applying and keep applying. Now, the reason why they had to do that was because it was mixed with sand and it was not effective. And because it wasn't done effectively to begin with, they would have to do multiple applications. In 1983, we did a study in Orangetown whereby we went to the town board and we said, listen, we think we can not only save the town money, but we can reduce the amount of materials we're putting out on the road. We want to switch from a sand salt mix to a 100% salt mix. We've been to school on this, and we believe it'll work. Town board was cooperative. That initially they said, well, we can't figure out how this is going to happen. You're going to have to put out much more salt, of course. And they also figured that at the price of salt. And we said, no, we think we'll put out the exact same amount, maybe even a little less salt, but we won't be paying for any sand, and afterwards we won't have to clean up after it. Well, the results verified what we had said, and from that point on, Orangetown became a town that provided 100% salt application, and many of the other communities, and I think all of them now in Rockland, have followed suit. As we went through this process, and it still is an evolution, we all understand that, one of the things we became aware of, that there was the potential, not only from possibly from road salt during snow and ice de-icing processes, but there was quite a bit of publicity about things such as contamination from wells. Well, the biggest thing that we found out was that the greatest contamination problem was from uncovered salt storage facilities. For that reason, the DEC promoted covered sheds, for instance. I think everybody in this county right now has covered sheds. As a matter of fact, in 1990, Orangetown was awarded the, and I have a copy of it here, Excellence in Storage Award. It's a national award. It's awarded to, I believe, three municipalities a year?
Well, now
3 to 6, okay. But at that time, it was 3 municipalities throughout the entire country. Now, Since that time, Rockland County has received this award. They received this in 95. Clarkstown has been awarded that award. So we're taking all the precautions we can to make sure that we eliminate the possibility of contamination to any wells. And quite frankly, we go to a lot of these seminars, and from what we heard, and we have a lot of legal representation at these. As far as I know, and I may be corrected tonight, but as far as I know, the only municipalities that have ever lost a case based on contamination of wells from Roadsalt is based on their storage facilities which leached into the ground. I don't believe that in this state there's ever been a case where a municipality has been sued and lost just due to salt application for snow and ice removal. That's an interesting fact because you have to understand how much salt really goes out there, and I brought a couple of props for you today. This year we had actually ended up having a very heavy winter. We had significantly more snowfall than normal, and we went out a lot more than normal. Now, I'm not going to put you on the spot. I was going to try to do that, but I don't think that's fair. I was going to ask you how much salt you think went down in front of your house during the course of the whole winter. How much salt do you really think we put out there? Anybody want to take a guess? Or how about one time when we go out? How much salt do we really put out there? Nobody's guessing, huh? I can tell you, huh? Actually, that's a very good guess. It's because I'll tell you, most people guess significantly over that. Excuse me. During the course of this entire winter, the average household in Rockland, in front of their house, this is for our department, for our roads, received approximately 1.5 of these. So you can see what a small amount of salt that is actually put down to give you safe roads. That's not, I don't think that's an overwhelming amount of salt. But that leads me to another area, and this is something that I had spoken with Legislator Jaffee about. Coincidentally, at this exact same time last year, I was attending another class, and it was put on by the APWA, and it was a gentleman, and I'm really not an expert in fertilizers or lawn care or anything like that. That's not my field. But he was, and he came to us and he said, you know, you guys are taking a bad rap because it seems that every time this year we hear about road salt and the problems and that. And we said, well, what's the problem? He says, well, he said, the problem is that what you do, you say you do, you're an easy target. He said, you say you put salt out there, and we do. We admit it. It's the only way we can get the job done properly and make our roads safe. But what this gentleman pointed out to us when we were there was that the largest single contributor to salt in our environment right now are these quote-unquote fertilizers that are going down. And he brought a bag in, and I brought a bag in. Because he pointed out that in that bag, that happens to be a 50-pound bag, 60% of that is salt. And the average household puts down approximately 4 bags of that. So you do the math on that, and you'll find out that comes out to about 120 pounds. Am I right? I'm not a math teacher. Who's the math teacher here? But I think you'll find that out. Now, I'm going to compare 120 pounds of salt from that to this. Now, what I would suggest is that we all work together. I'm just thinking that education's a great thing, and I got a big education when I heard that. And I think that some of our members got an education out of it too. Because, we're very defensive about it, and we realize we have limited resources and we have limited ways of doing it, but we don't like to be beat up all the time by people, generally speaking, don't know what they're talking about when they say we're the biggest contributor. If you calculate the number of residential parcels in this county, and then you multiply it times 120, you're going to come up with a significant amount of salt that's contributed to our atmosphere. So maybe that's something that your committee could look at. That's not our business. That's the legislature's business. But I'm going to leave this with you because this gentleman was very, very informative. He happens to be an organic landscape specialist, and he practices in the Hudson Valley. And so I'm going to leave that here for you, and maybe you'd like to invite him and let him talk. So I found that very interesting. The other thing is that came up was the subject of wells. Now, I have a well, and I also have a septic system. And I've discussed this with a number of people, and I know that when you put a well in, you should keep it away from the septic system, right? Where's the health department? Do you require it to keep it away?
Certain distances that are required.
That's right, right. And what certain states and certain other health departments are now requiring is that wells, when they're placed, be required to respect the same sphere of influence from roads as they do from septic systems. And we have personal, Bernie does and my inspectors, we have personal knowledge of this because this past year, there's a lot of development going on in the county, and we came upon 2 well drillers that were drilling wells right in the county right-of-way, right next to the road. Now, that doesn't take a lot of brains to tell you that if we are putting salt down, and even though it's only this much, or maybe twice that much, for a whole 100 feet in front of your house, that's what I used as the average, that there's a possibility that they may get an ounce or 2 in that well. But there's other things that get on the road. There's oil and grease and other things. And of course, any contamination that would go on the road has a much likelier possibility of making it into that well if that well is drilled right next to the roadway.
Do you know of what municipality,
Well,
familiar with any municipalities that have that?
well, we know which municipalities that had happened to, and we required that they be removed, capped and removed. We also know that there are existing, and listen, we all learn over time. We also know that there are existing wells within our right-of-way, which we found over the years. We have to deal with that on a basis. Some of these are in the northern reaches of our county on very steep areas. And we get calls from those people on a fairly regular basis asking us, making us aware that they're there. And we do that. I know Bernie's very much aware of it. And for that, with that in mind, and as one of the things we've also done is, we're not just going out there and salting or putting road salt, rock salt, sodium chloride on the roads. What we've initiated over the last year, a couple of years, and so a number of my fellow superintendents, we're doing a thing called anti-icing, where we go out with a very light application of liquid chemical. In some cases, it's magnesium chloride. In some cases, I don't know if anybody's using calcium chloride in this county, are they? I can only speak for us. We usually use magnesium chloride. And it's the equivalent of a lady's atomizer, if that's graphic enough, is the amount that goes down. But what it does is it prevents the bonding of ice and snow. Because if we do nothing on those hills, those are the same people who call us repeatedly, I can't get up my road. So, we have that balance we have to. But by doing that, that prevents the bonding of the ice and snow to the road, and we're able to clear it off much faster.
Do you have a mix to calcium? Well, you don't use calcium chloride.
No, we don't. I mean, other people do.
Mix calcium chloride with salt.
No, we don't mix it with the salt. What we do is we apply it onto the salt as it's dropping off the conveyor onto the spinner. We use, the average usage is around 50 gallons a mile. So if you can figure how much is 50 gallons a mile, that's not a lot. I mean, it's a very insignificant amount. That does a lot. So what we're saying is we've realized that using more is not always doing it better. We try to get the best effect using the least amount of chemicals that we can. And For that reason, this year, and we're still going over our numbers, I can tell you though, even though we had significantly more snow and ice and call-outs, we used about the same amount of snow as salt, as we've used in other years. So I think that's a big benefit, and I think it's something that you should be happy with and proud of, that we've taken these proactive measures.
So when you apply the de-icing, the magnesium chloride,
That's one we use. Also, they use salt brine. Some municipalities use salt
you
brine.
don't do that everywhere, you just do that in certain areas, so you adjust what your response to the roads and the needs of the roads in the various areas.
Yes, absolutely, and I'll tell you why we do that. We, generally speaking, I'm only speaking for the county. When we anticipate that there will be incidents of snow or ice, we have the opportunity then to go out midday or the day before. We know it's coming, and we're positive. We go out. We have 2 trucks equipped. One's down here in the new city yard. One's up in Stony Point. And those trucks go out, and they have a prescribed route, and they have set locations. And at that locations, they apply a fine mist to that section of road. They don't do all the roads. It's not necessary to do the flats. How many locations do we have, Bernie? Do you remember? About 24 locations, okay, with it throughout the county. And it's been a terrific success. I tell you that the last storm we had here, we went out early. We were very proactive. We even got out a little early and put the salt down as soon as it came. And even 2 hours into the storm, the cars were tracking right through. There was no binding and anything. And it allows us not to have to do repeated applications, not to try to treat from the top down. And in the long run, we end up reducing the amount of chemicals we use. So.
You were discussing with me also a new piece of equipment. So I wanted you to share.
Well, snow and ice removal isn't it's not a. You don't have to be a rocket scientist. Let me put it that way. But certainly, we've made a lot of improvements over the last 15 or 20 years. Both with the design of our trucks, the type of equipment we're using, and all of these go back to the same thing. We're looking for efficiency. Now, our trucks now have different types of engines, much more energy efficient engines. Hopefully, we're saving on the amount of fuel we use. We're using, many of our spreaders are stainless steel. We have a serious problem here in the county, and I really appreciate the support we've gotten through the legislature, the county executive. I mean, we're going to be having, hopefully, a new county highway facility in the relatively near future. These things will take a little time, but we'll be able to finally wash our equipment, which we've never been able to do. But, and for that reason, our equipment would rust away significantly. Just being out there in the elements does that, especially when it's loaded with salt. And it's not easy for us to get rid of it, get rid of that. We end up getting off as much as we can back in the storage facilities, but there's always a little residue. We've been working on a new design for a truck. It occurred to us that most of the basic functions are probably 50 or 60 years old. And not only myself, I know Orangetown's been working on different designs and other communities, but some of the things we've done is most of us have gone to polymer plows. Now, they're actually plastic mold boards on those plows, and people will say, well, that's a good idea because they don't rust. Well, one of the reasons we also use them is they have a very low coefficient of friction. And in the old days, now if you know some of the old timers, they tell you some of the tricks. What they used to do in the old days is they always painted their plows every year, and they would wax the plows. And why did they wax the plows? They waxed the plows so that the snow would roll off faster, but not only that, they got a lot better gas economy. So with these polymer mold boards, we're able to get much better gas economy, and they're a lot less maintenance, they're almost maintenance free. In particular, what we were discussing is, and I don't want to go into too much details because it hasn't been, we don't want to make everybody aware of what we're doing yet because there may be some patent infringement issues. But what we've been working on is a process. If you drive behind the average snowplow, what you see, and this is also, we believe it's going to significantly reduce the amount of salt we have to use. When you get behind that truck, the salt is spreading right out of the back. There's a spreader. I wish I brought a picture, but I think you can view it. There's a hopper. Sometimes there's a conveyor in the center. It drops down. There's a spinner, and that spinner spins the salt out into a pattern. Now, properly done, and that's why I want to mention education. We have a school for all our employees every year. We teach them how to snowplow, how to apply, when to apply these materials, what quantity or tonnage. All our equipment are ground speed controlled. That means that the volume coming out doesn't vary by the speed. It's always the same amount, and it goes up and down. The quantity coming out goes up and down whether the truck is going faster or slower. So we are always getting a good uniform amount of material coming out. But as we looked at that, the older trucks had flaps, and what they did was the idea was to deflect the salt or salt and sand or cinders or whatever they're using. As you forget we're way ahead of the curve in most of this state and most of this country. But what it does is it's supposed to move most of your material to the center of the road because roads are crowned. When it gets to the center of the road, then as it melts, it will work its way to the curb.
Is that the stripping process? There was I had read about. I'm sorry to interrupt you,
Yeah,
but I had read about a process of putting down the snow in strips rather than
Salt and strips. Yeah. Yes.
The salt in strips rather than.
Right, and that's one of the aspects of it that we're looking at is because one of the newer philosophies is using what they call a zero gravity discharge, which essentially discharges the salt at the same rate the truck is going, so it doesn't bounce as it comes out. It lands flat. Our process, which I'll give you a little tip on it, is to discharge almost directly on the center line, so that we're not getting any salt that's being thrown into the curb or into the gutter or onto that quarter of the road that's what I consider it's wasted. It's a waste, and so what we're trying to do is locate all our material towards the center line, right on the center line, and we have a process we're developing, and we'll hopefully be approving this design within the next week or so, which not only will discharge the salt there, it'll actually be mixed with an activating anti-icing mixture. Could it be calcium chloride or magnesium chloride? So it comes out almost like a paste. It goes down there, and we'll be able to put far less to achieve the same results as we are today.
When you do the plowing and you do pile up the snow in certain areas, isn't that a danger as well? Because then you're putting so much concentration of the salt that was out there, and the plows are now piling up the snow. Is that a danger in terms of our water wells and
Well, there's an old saying, you have to look at the volume of water that snow generates. That's one thing. Second of all, the only snow that we do pile up, if you're going to say it, is the windrow that's cast off from the snowplow. But you have to remember is we're putting down a very small amount of salt, and we put it down early so that it goes in those little crevices in the road. So it stays, the vast majority of it stays in there. When you plow it, it doesn't plow off. It's sitting in those little nodules down in there. And that prevents the ice and snow from bonding and holding on to the road. That's one of the basic principles of it. After, most people don't realize, and we get a lot of calls, your truck is going by and it's not spreading sand or it's not spreading salt. Well, we don't spread salt and sand the whole storm. A good operation, you probably would have to do it early on, which is the preventive process. You might have to do it partially during the storm, and then at the end to clear off the residue. But very little salt is actually plowed to the road, and I don't know how many times I've heard Bernie or my foreman going, don't spread salt and/or once we put it down, making sure that's working, do not drop those plows. We want to make sure it gets down all the way to the road. And then later on, when you get further accumulations, you really don't plow till you have 2 inches anyway. And by and large, very little salt is going over. But I'll tell you, I have, actually, I was talking to, I think I have his card here. This is an old trick, right? Someplace here. I was speaking with the DEC on this issue, and I speak with them quite regularly. I have a very good relationship with them. And I know Jim and my fellow superintendents have been doing a number of things, and they've addressed. And one of the things they have mentioned is they are far less concerned with salt than they are with sand. Sand gets in, sand is not something that will wash through the system, first of all, and that's probably how they look at it. We look at it because it clogs our catch basins, clogs our pipes, gets into a stream. Now, once it gets in the stream, that's when the DEC is worried about it, because what it does is it chokes all the spawning beds for the trout, right? Now, I'm a licensed guide, and I license for hunting and fishing, and that's one of the things. So I'm very sensitive to environmental and conservation requirements, and that's one of the reasons I have a good relationship with them, because they know that I'm aware of what's going on. I report it. But I also have discussed this extensively with, and I'll give his name, is Dave Lipsky, PhD, Director of Watershed, Lead, and Field Operations, Bureau of Water Supply, Quality Protection, Drinking Water, Quality Control, for the largest watershed in the world, the New York City DEP for the Catskills and Westchester. And I've had extensive talks with him on it, and you know, he says the same thing, essentially. They're worried about the suspended solids in the water that come down from the use of sand. And you go upstate and they use a lot of very fine, almost like a clay material that has absolutely no redemptive value at all. Neither does sand, for that matter, unless you have glare ice. And it only has there's a very small period of time where it actually gives you any skid resistance. It's the salt that does all the work. Right, so that's one thing that you have to know. I have to have discussions with him because I was worried about phosphates getting into our reservoirs. If you happen to look on this bag, besides being 60% salt, there's a heck of a lot of phosphates in there too. So I don't know. I don't want to talk too long. I probably talked too much already. But I'd like to thank you for having us. If you have any further questions, I'd be happy to answer you. And I think that's about all I have to say. Do you have any questions about our operations?
Let me, we have many presenters. I do want to say that, but I do want to give legislators an opportunity to ask any specific questions. Does anybody have a question at this time? No. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Veznetti. I'm sure that as we move through this process, there may be questions. If you wouldn't mind staying through the meeting, I would appreciate it.
Fine. In that pamphlet I gave out, there's a portion in there that comes from the Rockland County snow and ice removal policy. We, in this county, produced the first snow and ice policy in the state. This happens to be, we just redid this in 2003. When I say that in the state, we did it for Orangetown, actually. And then as soon as I came here, we ensured that we have it. We have in writing what we do here. We worry more about being sued for people getting killed on our roads because we haven't done our job correctly than anything else. We realize that we're dealing with people's lives and safety, and we want them to be able to be assured, and we want our lawyers to be able to show them that we're doing it the right way. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I
do have a question before we move on from highway departments, before we move to the health department, just briefly. I understood that both the Clarkstown and the Orangetown highway departments have in place or are building a system for collecting salty water runoff from the garage sites and spraying it on the roads to prevent ice. Mr. Ballard or Mr. Dean, is it something that you could address? I was informed, I was given this information, and I wondered whether you would respond to it.
I'll go first, and then I'll have Jimmy finish up.
Thank you.
My name is Wayne Ballard. I'm the Clarkstown Highway Department Superintendent of Highways. Me and Jimmy are sort of at different ends of the spectrum, but we're working towards together. The Clarkstown Highway Department, when I first took office, had a contamination problem related to our underground storage tanks. And since then, the New York State DEC has had their microscope on top of us. So we had to work towards a way of confining our salt runoff as well as a good way to wash our trucks. So we built a truck washing bay, and we have a 20,000 gallon tank that we capture all salt water. Now, thankfully, we have a great relationship with the Rockland County Sewer Department, who, during off-peak hours, we pump our salt water from our winter season down to them where they treat it. The game plan at our highway department is to build the system that Jimmy Dean has just built as he makes his own salt brine and reuse that fluid to create that the salt brine, so it would be extremely cost effective. Jimmy, he's at the other end. He'll explain the system to you better. And I want to also add that I'm a professional engineer. I'm a college grad, and Skip and Jimmy have taught me all those things you don't learn in Harvard Business School, so I have a lot of respect for them. So I'll leave that up to Jimmy.
Thanks, Wayne. I'm Jim Dean, Superintendent of Highways in town of Orangetown.
Thank you for being here.
This was, we had to be here. This is always a concern. You know, we're very much involved in trying to protect the environment as well as make safe roads. I've been in the highway department for 46 years. We had our first salt storage facility in 1964. And honestly, we had it because we realized that when you left salt out in the open, the rain would wash away 10%. It wasn't then an environmental issue, but we shortly realized that we didn't want to be putting that into the ground anyhow. And just because I'm talking about that now, I think one of the things that Skip brought out is really important to understand. Rockland County and New York State, but Rockland County in particular, has been way ahead of the curve for municipal storage of salt. We found out a long time ago, in some cases because there was litigation from wells that were polluted by salt storage. We understood that that's what we needed to do. And with the help of the legislatures and our assembly people and our senators, most of us have gotten money and we've built sheds that are adequate. But I'm going to make a pitch for the county highway facility because we're all, as town highway people, supporting the fact that at that facility they have an oversized shed. Because what happened to many of us, in Orangetown we have a shed for 3,000 ton. Our annual usage is more than that. So we either have to depend on supplies, and that, when it's out in the open, can be a critical concern. If we had a larger shed, we could store our materials there, go pick it up, but it would always be undercover. But as Wayne was talking about the reuse, we've been looking at it for some time, and one of the things that we instituted last year is we have a manufacturing system that allows us to take our granule salt, mix it with water, and put it in a 23% solution, which then gives us the ability to do anti-icing, where we're actually placing this on a road prior to a storm. And the reason we're doing that is to try to prevent the bond, because we've all learned over the years that you always want to move it from the bottom up. You don't want to fight it from the top down. This past season, which is really kind of parallel to what we had last year, although the timing was a little different, the amount of snow and the number of events, we judge our operations by events. This past year we had 20 events. We plowed 11 times, which was 2 times more than last year, which was similar events. And we did aggregate applications, which is salt, 30 times. Last year in the same time frame, we did it 38 times. Now part of that, we believe, is because we, through the beginning of this season, began our anti-icing program, which actually reduced the amount of times we had to do a full salt application because the bond was not there. The snow, as you plowed through, the roads cleared off. We've gotten a lot of feedback from our residents. They see this little white stripes on the road, and basically, it's a controlled application of the material that you see after a storm sometimes when you see the white cover. That's usually because there hasn't been enough precipitation to melt all the salt, and it's more difficult to regulate the granular salt than it is the liquid salt. So that's one of the things that we think is going to be a real big asset in reducing the amounts. And this year, it definitely reduced our applications and reduced the amount of salt that we had to use. Not to get too far off the track though, what we're planning to do, we have this brine making machine, and we're looking at what Wayne did with capturing the runoff, because when we're loading our trucks, we're doing that outside. Everything is undercover, but when we're loading, we have to do it outside. And that goes into the drain system. So our plan that we're developing now, we're looking for funding, and the town board is working to support this, is capture that, put that into storage, and then use that to make our salt brine. Or pump it right back onto our covered salt that will just evaporate and it stays. So we're not losing it, we're actually recycling the salt brine that there's no other way to control unless you had a completely closed shed and you're loading there. We think that that's going to be a really important thing. But most of the pollution issues that you find are due to storage. And that's not just here, that's nationwide. The key is, if we're not out there preventing that bond, and you get a hard pack, you get slippery conditions, you have a real danger to the public. Now, I did start in the highway department in '59. I did work on the back of a truck throwing cinders on the ground. And now imagine what cinders are. That's when you're burning coal to generate energy. If anybody ever did an environmental analysis of that material that we threw down, we probably would have been in real big trouble. But in those days, wasn't a consideration. We switched to sand because we couldn't get that. But in the early '60s, everybody in the industry became aware that salt had the ability to stop that bond. Many people here don't remember it, but if you ever drive on a hard-packed road, that's when the sand and the snow mixes together and actually forms a pack on the road that does not come off. In those days, school buses, cars, and everybody else had chains. It was completely unacceptable in Rockland County. So that's why we use salt. We're here speaking about this because it's the primary tool. And I can assure you that the highway superintendents in Rockland County talk about this. We have annual training in our department. We have critiques after our storms to see what we're using, how we're using it. We all abide by a sensible salting technique that was developed by the Salt Institute. And to get further information, if you go on the saltinstitute.org, they've got tons and tons of information. Of course, they're promoting salt use because they know how critical it is, but they've answered many of the questions that we're hearing now. So, and I think we all really welcome the idea to be able to discuss this. I mean, you have to understand that we're very concerned about the environment. We're also very concerned about the safety of the people that we have to provide service to.
Thank you, Mr. Dana. Thank you very much. Mr. Veznetti.
I just wanted to bring back one issue. I know where this all started because I asked for a little more money for salt, right?
Yes.
That's
where it started.
Now, the reason I asked for that money was not because we were using more salt. The reason I had to ask for that money was because in 2003, 2004, we were paying $29 a ton for salt. This year, we're paying $42 a ton for salt. Yesterday, there was a bid let in Westchester. Just to let you know, we watch what goes on in this field all over the place. A bid let in Westchester. The minimum price was over $60. The high price was $75. Now, I tell you, that has a good and a bad thing. You're going to have to give me more money for salt, but just remember, because of the price of salt, it's going to require people to be more creative in addressing these needs. They're going to have to say, how can we get this done more efficiently? Now, I'm not particularly worried about the fellows in Rockland County because we're working at it hard, but you just got to cross the border to some of our fellow counties where they really haven't addressed this problem at all. I go to Westchester, you still drive some of those roads, and you talk about pollution. During the spring and summer, it's like a dust bowl in there. The DEC, the DEC and the EPA have recognized that these crushed aggregates, because of snow and ice control, are creating an air pollution problem. That's something we've eliminated in this county. If you went to Andes, New York, you'll see the sides of the houses. They use a brownish, reddish clay up there almost for their snow and ice removal. The houses, they have to wash the houses in the summertime. So that's something we have eliminated. But I just want to let you know that it is going up.
Well, if we had more green space and less roads, if we build less roads and have more green space and less development, perhaps we would have less cost and less concern.
Correct.
On that note, did you want to respond to what we were discussing?
Can I ask a quick question? Yeah,
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead. And please identify yourself.
Keith Cartnick, I'm the Director of Water Quality for United Water. It's encouraging to hear some of the things you're talking about. I'm just curious, have you looked into any using calcium-based products exclusively in sensitive areas, or what would be the issue with not using calcium-based rather than?
Could you repeat the question, Skip, when you get to the microphone?
He's asking if we've looked at using calcium-based products in certain areas. Actually, we've looked at most of a variety of products that are possible. The problem is some of them are cost prohibitive. I've looked at products that are $1,200 a ton. Now, they're relatively environmentally benign. Unfortunately, you have to use 4 times as much to achieve the same effect as salt. And when I'm paying even $60 a ton, if I had to use 4 times as much a ton, and it's at $1,200 a ton, you figure it out. I don't want to be paying $4,800 to do the same thing I can do with $42. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and I don't think the taxpayers would tolerate it. But being that you are do work for the water company, I think maybe you should come and visit the highway superintendents. We could have a nice discussion, because I know the DEP in upstate New York is funding different projects that will help with storage and things of that will help you environmentally. We certainly want to work hand in hand with you. There's no doubt about that. I guess a good amount of the water you get is from wells. You also have reservoirs, you know. I know the people from the reservoirs tell me that their solution is the solution to pollution is dilution. So I'll leave on that.
Thank you. I'm going to ask now for Mr. Dan Miller, the geologist from the Environmental Division of the Health Department, and Judy Hundefund, also from the Health Department, to give a presentation now. So I'm going to move out of the way.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chairman. What I plan to do is look at not just road salt, but our use of salt in Rockland County, and try to answer the question, is salt a problem? Well, the short answer is yes. This map is just obviously a county-wide map, and the asterisks on the map show areas where the health department has done surveys or is in some other way aware of problems with salt contamination. Some of these, as the highway superintendents pointed out, are related to salt storage areas. Some are not. And in some cases, we don't have a very good handle on exactly what the source of the salt contamination was or is. It could be from runoff as a result of application of salt. Could also be as a result of, as I just learned, you know, I'll have to add as one of my potential sources is over-application of fertilizers. You know, the way fertilizers are supposed to work, if you apply them at the rate that the directions suggest, the idea is that they're all consumed by plant growth. But as we know in Rockland, people like their emerald green lawns, so I'm sure it's not a big stretch to think that people over-apply. But we have another potential source, and I'll get to that. Okay, so the points of discussion that I plan to cover are different types of salt, potential sources, maximum contaminant levels for the constituents of salt in drinking water, what are the treatment options if you find that it is in your water, what ongoing research that we have, and potential solutions. All right, quick education. We all think of salt, most of us think of salt as sodium chloride, rock salt, table salt. Salt is actually a much more generic term, and it's really a compound that results from replacing the hydrogen atoms in an acid with some metal ion. And there's quite a large number of salts that can result. we often classify those salts by the type of negative ion that results. Chloride is the most common, and so we have chloride salts. We also have bicarbonate salts and acetate salts, and I'll tell you why I mentioned those particular two in a minute. The chlorides are obviously the most common. NaCl, or sodium chloride, is table salt or rock salt. Potassium chloride, KCl, you may also know of it as no salt, the salt substitute. There's also calcium chloride and magnesium chloride. Both of those two are sometimes used, as we just heard, as de-icing agents. Another salt, and this one's not used for de-icing, but it's another one you might be aware of, bicarbonates and sodium bicarbonate, baking soda. These are all salts. Acetates are another type of salt that has seen some use as in the road de-icing arena. Calcium magnesium acetate that goes under the name or acronym CMA has gained some popularity, although it's pretty expensive. And sodium acetate is used almost exclusively for runway de-icing. Okay, so potential sources. Salt storage is obviously one. Application of salt for de-icing is another potential source. And that's not just for roads, but parking lots, sidewalks, driveways, and these could be commercial or residential. And there's certainly many others, and I guess we can throw fertilizer in with those. Not for de-icing, but we'll add that. Also, one that most of us don't think about, and we feel could be in many cases very significant source of salt into the groundwater, is the discharge from water softeners. Most people use a sodium chloride brine to regenerate the resin that's used for softening water. Water softeners act on the basis of a cation exchange. The resin that's inside that tank in your basement is a cation exchange resin. It's an organic resin that has sites that can that will adsorb or let calcium and magnesium cling to them. After some period of time, all those sites are used up, and it can no longer soften the water. The water is softened by removal of calcium and magnesium. So what's done is actually a saturated solution of sodium chloride. Some use potassium chloride, but it's less common. Is flushed through that resin. It strips off the calcium and magnesium ions and leaves those sites open again to take calcium and magnesium again. So that brine is then discharged into the sewer, if we're lucky, or into the septic system if we're not. And so many of the same people who have wells have septic systems, and they're discharging their effluent or their waste from their softeners into the same aquifer that they're using to take their drinking water from. You mentioned, Skip, the idea of separation distance from septic systems to wells. Those separation distances are primarily designed to assure that bacteria die before they get to the drinking water system. Unfortunately, salt doesn't die. So while it's certainly helpful to be further away from the source of salt, it may not ensure that you're not going to get that salt into your well.
And could I add that it goes into the aquifer, the underground, it could actually follow the flow and go towards the well or to another well, and even take more time depending on the flow of the underground water system. I don't know if you're using the accurate terms, but
No,
I
that's
was reading
true.
about something to that effect.
No, groundwater does flow, and that's a good point. The water in your aquifer doesn't just sit there. There's in virtually every situation, there's a gradient, and water always flows down gradient, not necessarily downhill, but most of the time it's downhill. So water does flow. The water in your aquifer flows, and so salt that enters at point X can eventually migrate to point Y, and so you may get salt into a well significantly down gradient from where the source was. Okay, maximum contaminant levels. Chloride is really the only constituent of the salts that we're using that has a regulatory limit, and that's 250 milligrams per liter, or parts per million. Once salt is dissolved into the water, when we do an analysis of the water for salt, we actually analyze chloride and sodium, or chloride and calcium, or potassium, or whatever the cation is. And it's actually the chloride that we have a regulatory limit to control. Sodium does have health-based guidelines for people with, and this is a New York State Department of Health guidelines. For people with severe sodium restriction, that guideline is 20 milligrams per liter. And for moderate sodium restriction, it's 270 milligrams per liter. Beyond that, it's really an issue of taste. For calcium and magnesium, there are no limits. So that's where we are with the regulatory limits. What are the treatment options if you find that you have salt in your water? Well, there are no good ones. Because salts have a very high solubility limit, which, by the way, is what makes them effective as de-icing agents. Almost anything that you can get into solution in the water will reduce the melting point of the water, and that's why they work as de-icing agents. But because they are so soluble in water, it's very difficult to get them out of the water if you don't want them there. So about the only two options that I know of are distillation, and that's generally a batch process. It's really not amenable to automation and tying into some sort of a water treatment system. And then reverse osmosis is the other. Most applications for reverse osmosis, so you'll commonly hear it called RO, are only for a single drinking water tap. You'll see one spout at the sink, and that's what's used for drinking and cooking. It's pretty expensive to use it in a whole house application, and it has its problems because it almost completely deionizes water. It makes the water very corrosive, and in most cases, if you don't want your copper pipes then to be leached and have pinholes in your pipes, you may actually need to then add some other chemical, probably a phosphate, to keep it from eating your pipes. It also has this bad problem, or side effect, in that to produce clean water, you generate a significant quantity of wastewater, or the brine that's left over with more concentrated salt concentrations than the clean water that's produced. And it's the typical RO unit produces 4 or 5 times as much wastewater or waste brine as the volume of finished water. And that has to go somewhere. Again, if we're lucky, into a sewer. If we're not, right back into the septic system where it's going to be recycled again. There is some ongoing research. I didn't deal with this, but there is also ongoing research into de-icing methods to try to improve application, styles of application, materials to apply. Some of those Mr. Veznetti talked about tonight. Within the county, we are also in the midst of an ongoing assessment of our water resources. And Madam Chairman mentioned Paul Heisig of the USGS. He's leading this initiative. And we're working hand in hand with Paul, and some of the initial work is showing that we do have indications of high conductivity. I'll say that one of the first things Paul does when he gets a well that he can use for his research is run a conductivity log. And it's an electrical conductivity, and his primary purpose is to look for water flow. When the water chemistry changes significantly when there's an influx of water into the well. So when he sees a dramatic increase or decrease in conductivity, he knows there's a fracture there that's contributing water to the well. So that's his purpose. But as he goes through that research, he's also learning that in many areas of Rockland, there's indications that there is high conductivity, which is usually ascribed to high chloride levels, salt levels, in our shallow aquifers. So what are the solutions? It's a tough issue. There's always a trade-off between road safety and environmental damage. There are some alternatives to using sodium chloride for road de-icing. Some of them are already in use. Skip mentioned that he uses magnesium chloride in its liquid form, and that's one of the options. It's still a chloride. We're still putting chlorides into the environment in some manner. There are some others, this CMA, or calcium magnesium acetate, I mentioned earlier. Some of these are very expensive, and maybe this is one, maybe my numbers are old, but what I had was $650 per ton for CMA versus $30 per ton for sodium chloride. So some of the alternatives that have less deleterious effects on the environment are extraordinarily expensive. It may come a time where we have to make those tough decisions. Does it ever become feasible that we use those expensive products?
One would have to balance the economic feasibility of having to do something regarding the wells that are contaminated. Massachusetts had to spend millions and millions of dollars in responding to enormous contamination in wells. They had to replace wells, and that becomes another issue. So it's always a balance.
That's right. I mean, that's why I said there may come that time. If we continue, and I'll go back a little bit to the continuing research. We do want to take a very close look at what's happening over time to our aquifers, and there may be some opportunities for us to get some older data where we hopefully can get a time series of data on salt contents, at least in some localized areas. And you know, what I'd like to do is look at the trends and see where we're going or how fast we're increasing in concentrations, because if we get to the point where our entire aquifer, where we're drawing drinking water, is contaminated to levels we can't drink it, and we're left with the only possibility of having large desalinization plants, well, all of a sudden the $650 per ton for less problematic de-icers may not be such an incredible number or incredible cost. All right, that's all I had.
I have a question. Now, I know that...
Mr. Veznetti, if you want to, please come to the microphone.
Yeah, I have a question, and it just occurred to me. We know that New York State is one of the largest salt producers in the world, right? Okay. Now, I don't know, are there any salt deposits in Rockland County that, I don't really know, I'm just asking.
Natural deposits?
Naturally, yeah, because in New York, we have some of the largest resources of salt, and it's mined. That's where, so you know, they don't make it in a plant, they mine it under the ground. Now, if there were salt deposits, and this was just occurred to me, in a lot of the places where people are building nowadays in Rockland, they're not places where they would have built before. Of course, the last places to be developed are the least affordable to develop, and a lot of those are in very rocky areas, and there's a lot of blasting going on. That's what one of the things that occurred to me is, could that be having any effect on it?
They can turn off the light.
The short answer is no. We do not have evaporite deposits in Rockland County. The sedimentary rocks are clastic sedimentary, mostly sandstones and clays. And then we have a lot of the ridges that we're developing now are igneous and metamorphic rocks. But so no, there aren't any evaporite deposits.
Since we are talking about water, the issue of water quality, I thought perhaps I would ask United Water Representative Don DeStante if he could discuss their tracking briefly of sodium and chlorides in the reservoir and groundwater. Could you make some comments regarding that, Mr. DeStante?
What I did better than that is I brought a water quality expert with us. You know?
Great.
It's not my field. I brought Keith, and he's going to give you a little bit of a little on this.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Keith Kartnick. I already introduced myself. I'm just actually looking at some of the data we used for our CCR for this year. And if you look at that, which everybody should have a copy of, our sodium, I'm looking at sodium really, and the average is around 33 parts per million. And the range is anywhere from 7 to 97. And we see levels in the wells. That's actually where the highest level of sodium was, up to about 97. You see a lot of it in the Ramapo area and in the Spring Valley area. And again, these are samples we take in requirements of our compliance for sampling, which is not necessarily going to be peak times. So there could be issues with that. If you got a big rain after a salt, you could have issues with water running into the reservoirs. Reservoir is probably less of a concern because it's transient. It will flush through. But on the other hand, you could get peak levels of sodium at that time. That's about all I have. I got kind of short-called on this. But we have a lot more data if anybody's interested. But this is pretty representative. It's not something that changes radically, in the wells. You will see swings in the surface water just because of the nature of it. And as I said, that's not something that is tracked storm to storm or application to application. But it is a concern. This actually came up at one of the meetings, I think, a couple of years ago, where what could we do about it? And that's why I asked about the magnesium and calcium-based products. I realize they're expensive. They're also in a lot of the Northeast have limited application around reservoirs. You'll see that up in New England a lot. Low salt area as a warning. On the other hand, I won't dismiss the safety concern. So it is a balance, but that's why I think we may need to start looking at products that are, maybe a little more expensive, but less sodium. And as Dan pointed out, sodium is just a recommended limit. For most of us, you eat a bag of potato chips and you're going to get a lot of sodium. But the other side of it, as he pointed out also, is it's a very hard thing to treat. Once it's in your water, if you do have a sodium-restricted diet, there's really not too much you can do, economically and practically. So, really all I have. I mean, if anybody has any other questions.
Yes, Mr. Dean has a question, and any of the legislators, if you have any questions. Mr. Dean?
Legislators go first.
I don't see any. I would have done that, certainly.
I just have a question based on the study was done in Ramapo and the Spring Valley area. I think part of that consideration has to be how many septic systems there are in sewers. Because I recently was at a program put on by the DEC in December where they have representative from the EPA there, and they're identifying 30 to 35% of the salt in the water coming out of water softeners. It's interesting in the article that was in the paper a couple of weeks ago where the homeowner said, I have a well, but I put salt in it.
Right.
So, I mean, if we're talking about areas that are not fully sewered, then anything that's going into the septic is going into the well.
No, I think you're right.
We need to really identify where it's coming.
Sure, as Dan pointed out, there's many sources. But I do think you do have that significant effect of storm-related events. Now, that's a transient thing, so we have to weigh that also. And we have to weigh how, for safety versus transient events, it's not an easy situation.
You mentioned the document you thought we had. We apparently don't have it.
The Consumer Confidence Report, I think that that's mailed out. Oh, actually, you know what, you'd have last year's.
Okay.
It comes out June 1st, you'll be receiving it. That's the annual water quality report.
If you can get us a copy?
Sure.
So that we have it on record, that would be very helpful.
It's online, actually, too.
It's online?
It's on, yeah, you can get it online.
Would you get that for me? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. DeSanti. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Are there any questions? Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to note that the second part of the agenda I have canceled it because I thought that it would be running so late and everybody would be losing their patience. So Diane Phillips left. She was very gracious to stay, but I think that she and I both agreed that it would probably be best for her to come back at another time when everybody's fresh and not focused on this particular issue. So I hope you don't mind that I took the liberty to do that. We have another short presentation from Mr. George Petanovich, who has had issues with wells and water. And he's going to make a presentation.
Okay, it's going to take a minute for it to come up on the screen. My name is George Petanovich. I live in Stony Point, and also president of the Stony Point Action Committee for the Environment, and very concerned about water issues. As it turns out, I have a bit of experience on this issue, having been on the receiving end of Roadsalt at my home. Let me see if I can get our chart set 1 minute. My presentation is titled "No Salt, Please: A Fight for My Family, My Home, and My Water" from 1994 to 2002. It's hard for me to imagine, really, that this problem with my road salt happened over 10 years ago. It was a battle that took a large part of my time as a homeowner. I was concerned about the environmental impacts on the quality of the drinking water in my home, but also on the value of my home, which was significantly reduced because I had no potable water for that period of time. And my family was using bottled water. Just to give you an idea of where I live on the western part of Stony Point, on Gate Hill Road and Old Gate Hill Road, as you enter Harriman State Park, going up to Lake Welch. My house is like the last house you'll see as you go into the park. So my house is actually surrounded by parkland on 3 sides. There's nobody next door to me applying road salt to their driveway or other sort of extraneous chemicals on their lawns. I really live in an isolated area. It's kind of a unique location. And this is where it looks like in the wintertime. This was the winter of 1993, 1994. When this problem began, although when I took this picture I didn't realize I had a problem. I just thought it was a beautiful scene of the snow. And this is what Old Gate Hill Road looks like. Where the arrow points on the left was really a significant part of the photograph, as it turns out, because this is also a corner property where the county maintains those two joining roads, Gate Hill Road and Old Gate Hill Road, and routinely plowed snow onto that corner during that winter. If you remember, the winter of 1993, 1994 was a unique winter. We had probably like 30 snowstorms or something, so there was a tremendous amount of snow. And a lot of salt was also placed on that intersection just above my home. And as I observed the plow trucks, they would plow that snow from that intersection onto the corner of my property. Didn't think it was a problem at the time. But of course, when the snow melted, you could see that there was lots of granules of salt on that corner. Again, I didn't realize this at the time. This was a photograph I had taken later. But indeed, the snow that was plowed contained the salt. So while it was pointed out earlier that many of the problems with road salt has to do with storage issues, and many of those issues have been resolved by covering the piles of road salt, which is very true. This is an issue of application, but in fact, plowing snow and plowing salt with the snow, and in fact, concentrating salts in certain areas. So the practices that we use for how we move snow around has an effect on how concentrated the salt is in other areas. It's important for us to consider that as well. Before I realized I had any kind of a salt issue, I was noticing some strange things happening in my house, like the bathtub water was turning blue. I had no thought in my mind at all that this could have been something related with outside my house. I thought I didn't scrub the Ajax off of it or something, when I scrubbed it last time. Or there was something going on with my water heater. that I didn't know. But this is what would routinely happen when I would draw a tub in that bathroom, is the water would have a blue, and it's even more intense blue than you see on the screen. And you can see the stains that were left from the, what eventually realized was probably the copper reaction with the salt, but it was a reaction from this problem, and it stained my tub. So this is, no idea why this was happening. The spring after that summer, there was a tree on my property that bloomed. All the new leaves came out of the tree, and then all of a sudden, all the leaves just dropped in the springtime when all the new leaves came out. I said, it was like all the leaves almost fell off the tree, and I said, what's going on? Why would the tree lose all of its leaves like that? I found out later, after I realized I had a problem, that indeed the tree was suffering the effects of a drought because the salt was preventing the water from actually being taken up into the tree. And so even though we had plenty of rain that spring, the tree was reacting as if we had a drought because of the concentration of salt. Again, at this point, I did not know what was happening. I just thought it was unusual that this was happening. And this is what the corner looks like in the fall of that year, the fall of 1994. And during the late summer, I had visitors come to my home and say that my water was tasting really salty. You see, I lived in the house and worked out of the house at the time and didn't taste the salt, so that wasn't a good indication of whether or not I had a problem. But other people were telling me that your water tastes salty. Now, I had the best tasting water. I'll tell you, my water is just as good as the Poland spring water that you buy. That's how good quality. My water was delicious. People used to come to my house to fill up their jugs of water. So I had a hard time believing that anybody said my water was salty, but indeed, that's the case. And after some tests from the health department, I found out that indeed there was a concentration level of chlorides in my water of 770 milligrams per liter of chlorides. And if you look at this view, you're looking at the foreground of the wellhead where my well is located under the driveway. Back where number 1 is the corner. Number 2 is where the tree was that I started to notice the leaves falling off of it. The evergreen tree, which I didn't show a picture of it, but it started to turn yellow. It was actually yellowing in the tree, which I didn't understand why that was happening. And of course, once I had the well test done, I realized that I had high concentrations of sodiums and chlorides. And the only explanation for that was Roadsalt. And this is when I began to connect the dots and realized what was causing this problem and why my water was contaminated. Now, the next winter, the county went back to, even though at the point I had to file a notice of claim with the county because I believed I had a legitimate claim and an injury, the county was going back to still plowing snow on that corner. I began, at some point later, noticing my pipes were corroding. I was getting corrosive residue on my pipes. Fixtures were corroding from taking a shower. Once you finish taking a shower, the actual outside of the fixtures were corroding, fixtures dissolving. The picture in the upper left-hand corner is inside of a wall, which the pipe started to leak. So a lot of my plumbing fixtures started to deteriorate. And so you're living in a house where you really don't know what's going to happen next in terms of what leak may happen. Maybe you're not going to be home and it'll be a major water problem. So I was getting a lot of plumbing bills, having plumbers come in and replacing fixtures. And also I was noticing some of the trees on my property were not producing leaves and were dying on that corner. I actually waited about 2.5 years. We're trying to work with the county because I really believe the county was going to try to resolve this problem. But when I didn't see enough progress being made, I decided I needed to tell my story to the public. And I went public with the story in the spring of 1997. And this was one of the early articles. And the fact that I was not only having contaminated water in my home that I couldn't drink, but also that the fixtures in my home, and all my plumbing and my water heater and everything else was corroding. The same kind of corrosion that we see from salt on the roads, the sidewalks, our cars. This is all inside my home that was corroding as well. It was a year later, the spring of 1998, that we also start to see this contamination level start to show in my neighbors' homes. So now you have the people who live just below me. We're starting to notice their wells were now being contaminated as well. So this problem was spreading to the dozen or so homes, that maybe not even a dozen homes that are below my home. The following spring, since I wasn't really seeing enough progress, I decided I'd go one more step and put a sign in my yard, which I put there for 2 years. That's attracted a certain amount of attention from the town, who tried to give me a violation notice that I was violating the sign law. and NBC News came up to visit. But the purpose of the sign was to let people know that I had this problem all year round. This wasn't just a winter problem when we think about road salt. And indeed, all year long, I couldn't drink my water. We were drinking bottled water for everything, using it for everything, and showering, make your skin dry. I mean, it was a problem living in the house all during this 7 or 8 year problem. This is what the sign looked like in the wintertime. I had a furnace that lasted a fairly short amount of time, I think about 10 years. And that actually, if you can see in the bottom left-hand corner of the right side panel, you see a hole was eaten right through the bottom of the furnace. I went through, I think, about 2 or 3 water heaters. It was an expensive thing in terms of having to deal with the repair work, the plumbing, as well as the stress of having to live without water in your home. I got to know the guys from Poland Spring pretty well. They came to deliver the water every week or two, a couple of weeks. And Panko was replacing my water heater that day. I also, at the time, in the year 2000, my wife and I had a daughter, and we couldn't really use that salty water to bathe her. So we were actually bathing her in Poland Spring water because we had no other water source in the house. Now this is an article, one of many articles that we're about to story in the Journal News in the year 2002, which is fairly close to the time we eventually got water brought to our home. It wasn't mentioned earlier that indeed the counties are not, the local municipal governments are not often successfully sued by homeowners because of application of road salt, that most of it has to do with storage, and that probably is true. And the really reason for that is not that there's not application problems. I think there's a lot of application problems. The way the laws are written, it makes it very difficult for someone to bring that lawsuit because there's a very short time limitation. And that's what happened to my case. But in that, I got my neighbors who lived down the street to file their claim on time. This is what brought about the counties finally funding the extension of the water line. So when we talk about the cost of road salt per ton as being $30 per ton, I guess what I'm trying to say with this presentation is we have to consider the actual costs of road salt, not only to private homeowners, such as myself, of which I believe there's many that may not even realize they have these problems right now, but probably do, but also that we see the type of corrosion in our cars, in parking garages, road deterioration, bridge deterioration. These are all the additional costs of using road salt that are costing us as taxpayers. So while it's not coming out of the county's highway department budget, and I respect the fact that the highway departments have a budget and they can't spend $650 a ton for material, although I think when we look at it in comparison to not having a water supply, I think we have to consider the fact that if we see escalating levels of sodiums and chlorides in our public water supplies, United Water is saying they're seeing 33 milligrams per liter, right, of sodium. Well, 20 is a limit for people with low sodium diets. So right there, they shouldn't be drinking the water, if I understand that correctly. I know that's been a problem in the past with other, with municipal water. So we're reaching a point where we have to look at the fact that policies have to change. And the way we use this chemical is having an effect. It's not just the cost of the road salt, but indeed the larger cost to us as people that live here and own properties. Because if you don't have potable water in your home, your property is not worth very much. So the county extended this water line over a mile and almost a mile and a half up to our homes at a cost of about $1.3 million. So there's another cost that was involved with using road salt. And these are the guys busy at work bringing the water line up Willow Grove Road. And finally it arrived at our home, and then it cost me another couple of $1,000s to actually hook into the water line. And finally I got water on January 18th, 2002. A very happy day. This is a problem that goes beyond my particular problem. In that I was involved with this issue, a lot of people came to me for advice on what to do, and sent me news articles and such. And here's one from New Jersey, West Milford, New Jersey. Had to do with lawsuit against a municipality. Someone actually picked up a water bottle and fell down and broke their hip and died. So there was actually a death involved in having the bottled water, which was kind of an unusual situation. But indeed, these homes were contaminated with storage issue, with road salt. And then you have right here in Chester, New York, where 24 new homes were built without well testing, which is another issue I think that's very important, that we should be doing well testing for more than just bacteria. This is one of the initiatives that the county is trying to advance, is that well testing is important. Well, it's important when you buy a home to test for more than just bacteria, because these 24 or 27 homes were constructed without testing, and what did they find? They found that they were built adjacent to the storage facility, where for many years it had not been covered, and those homes were built new with no water. There's a financial impact right there. So of course now the community is, I'm not sure how this all ended up, this was a couple of years ago, maybe someone knows the answer, but the municipal government in Chester was looking to extend the water line to those homes, so another expense for the taxpayers. This was an interesting article in the New York Times where Roadsalt was thought to be the reason why electrical wires, underground electrical wires, corroded and caused an explosion in their street. And highway crews are trying to reduce the use of road salt, especially over in Westchester, because we know that that is a source of water for New York City, and everyone's very aware of the fact that the cost for developing a filtration plant for New York City would be astronomical. So they tend to be a lot more aware of that issue over there because of the Cronin Reservoir and studies that were done by the USGS and others about that watershed. But we should be looking at the same thing here. We know our water resources are very finite in Rockland, and they're even stretched to the limits. Well, people's private wells are a very legitimate source of drinking water that meets the need for water in the county. And if we're polluting that water, we're just reducing the source and supply. When are we going to get to a point where we're going to say we don't really have the water to support the number of people that live here, and we're continuing to build as it is? So this is an issue. I don't think this is an issue we're going to look at in the future. I think this is an issue we should be looking at right now. And I've made a request to the County Highway Department to discontinue plowing snow onto my property. And it's a convenient corner, but there are adjacent corners where I don't live, and I've asked that, but that has not happened. So my question is whether or not the county's procedures for removal of snow have indeed changed significantly, if they're continually, this past winter, still plowing snow onto my property. I would eventually like to use my well. Maybe it will clear out and I can use it for some purpose. And I won't be able to do that if every year we're continually putting snow onto the corner of my property. I was at a meeting here where United Water, I think we even referenced this tonight at the meeting on May 7th, 2003, showed this chart, and it caught my attention because it was a chart that indicated the amount of chloride levels in Lake DeForest. And there were 2 points where it starts to go up. One was, well, both of them are in March, 2 years apart, 1 year apart. You see 83 milligrams per liter in March of 2002. And then in March of 2003, it went up to 110 milligrams per liter. So looking at that as about a 33% increase. And I guess the question is whether that's significant in a reservoir. I haven't seen any data really related to the groundwater and whether or not that's an increasing issue. But if we're talking about something that's escalating like this every year, this ought to raise a lot of concerns because this is our drinking water source. We talked a little bit about CMA. I have some literature on it. There's also, we can send for some information. Yes, it's expensive per ton, but also it sounds like the cost of road salt's going up as well. This also indicates that CMA has less of a corrosive effect on concrete and bridges and things like this. So I think that would have to be considered an aspect of whether or not we start to use these alternatives. This chart, which is in a brochure, is much less than road salt and even much less than tap water, the rate of corrosion on concrete, on steel, and on aluminum. And then there's a comparison chart as well where they compare the use of CMA and road salt and the advantages of CMA over road salt. This is produced by the company that produces the CMA, but there's environmental benefits, there's health benefits, there's aquatic life benefits, as well so these corrosive, less corrosive. So that's my presentation. I appreciate your attention. I couldn't miss this opportunity to come and speak tonight, and thank you very much.
I want to thank you, George. I had to let George come and speak this evening. This subject and this issue impacted his life and his family's lives, and I think that he really adds to the conversation in truly presenting a picture, a real-life picture of what happens when we are not vigilant and when we are not cautious about what we do regarding road salt and many other issues, but in particular this one. We're going to have one more presenter, which will be very short, and then any other questions that we have that any legislators can ask any of the presenters, anyone that's here. Certainly, we have learned a great deal this evening, and I know that this is just the beginning of this important conversation. I just don't want the evening to end or anybody to leave before I just thanks Mr. Veznetti and superintendents of highway from Clarkstown and Orangetown and others who have attended this evening to be able to help us understand what the county is attempting to do, what towns are attempting to respond to this very real issue. And I know that we will continue to have this conversation, look at some of the issues that were raised this evening, and I look forward to that. Right now, we're going to have Mr. Boyd, who is a well driller, and Mr. Henry Boyd asked if he could, I know that he had made some comments at a previous meeting. We asked him if he could join us this evening to discuss the issue of road salt and contamination in wells. Thank you, Mr. Boyd.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to come up in front of the legislature and speak. Dan and I were at the opposite end of the tables last month over the well drilling codes, but now Dan and I are on the same track here. You know, I am the former president of the New England Groundwater Association. I am the president of the Empire State Water Well Drillers Association, and I'm representing them here tonight more than myself. I am a licensed and registered well driller in the county of Rockland. I do some drilling in here, and I'm really concerned about the water quality that's coming out of the wells, the brand new wells that we drilled today. I love salt. I put salt on my tomatoes, I put salt on my French fries. I think it's the greatest thing. My body has a special taste bud just for salt, as everybody else does, but that taste bud is probably there to tell you when you're getting too much. It's probably not, we use it for pleasure with the old salt shaker, but too much salt, you don't go to the ocean and drink the water and say, this tastes really good. It's going to make you nauseous, and you're automatically going to reject it from your body. I love salt on the roads. I love the black roads right after we get done with a snowstorm. The highway departments do a great job, and they get those roads black and clear so I can go 70, 75 miles an hour down the interstate roads and speed like a son of a gun on the day after a snowstorm, which 10, 15 years ago was unheard of. But I did go to a DEC meeting, and I asked them about the salt around the reservoirs. DEP meeting over in Westchester for the Westchester reservoirs, and this meeting was held over in Connecticut. I raised my hand and asked them about the salt going in the reservoirs, and they said, well, we want the roads black and clear so people in the Mercedes and the BMWs can go to work on time. But what's going to happen is we have to slow down. I know Rockland County is a pretty busy place, but we can't afford we can't afford to ruin the water quality of the county, of the state, just so people can drive fast. People have to slow down. We have to stop using salt on the roads. Is there an alternative? No. All these other chemicals, they're all chemicals. There's not one of those chemicals that you would take a handful of it, put it in your mouth like popcorn. Not one of them. And these all go into the water table. Now, the salt, you know, it turns into sodium, it turns into chloride. And as it goes through the ground, salt water migrates through the ground much quicker than clean water. Because when you add salt to water, it becomes denser. And when you have a well and you start to pump the well, the salt water migrates down to the well so much faster, and so that people end up with these problems. Now, these guys are doing a great job. How many people from the highway department have wells? 1, 2. Have you ever tested your own wells for chloride?
Mr. Boyd, please please address the legislature and the questions through the chair.
And the thing is, what was the water quality of their wells? And now there are no natural salts in this area. So if you have one chloride or one sodium, it's coming from possibly fertilizers. I don't know about fertilizers. I don't use fertilizers because fertilizers shouldn't be used with anybody that has a well, because the fertilizers will also go into your well. Anybody who has a well should not use it at least within 100 feet of their well. You have to treat it like a septic system. If there's any chloride at all, it is from our own contamination. It's from the roads or from water softeners. There are people that put in 300 or 400 pounds of salt in a water softener every year. Water softeners are something else we have to deal with. There should be special permitting. The water from a water softener, if someone needs a water softener and shows great need for it, it should only be hooked up to their hot water system in their house. It will not hurt your cold water pipes. There's no sense in softening flush water. And only hook it up to the furnace. You're only going to use probably a third of the water for your hot water needs. And people should get demand water softeners, so that it doesn't come on and generate once a week. It only comes on when it's needed to be regenerated. It's a fairly new generation of water softeners. It cuts down on it, but the salt from the water softeners, as it goes through, everybody drinks it if they like it or not. And when it's discharged, you're discharging high concentrations of salt into the ground. It should be put in a tank and hauled away just like the septic pumper comes in. It's the only way we're going to control that. The salt on the roads, how did they start using salt? Basically, from what I can figure out, they used to put the salt in the sand to keep the sand from lumping and clumping. If you put 5 to 7% salt in the sand right now, you're only going to use 5 to 7% of salt on the roads for now until you come up with something better. What the highway departments have to do is drop the plow. You know, a wear blade on a plow is a couple of $100. You have to buy some more wear blades. These people are talking about buying stainless steel trucks so they can spread this stuff on the road. You don't have to spend the money on that. You plow the roads, put up some signs, tell people the speed limit when it's snowy is 15 or 20, 25 miles an hour. You will get there safer. If you have a crash, you will probably not get killed. You will get a lot of phone calls from people, there's no doubt about it, with the BMWs and the Mercedes, but they will get there safer and they will be able to drink the water in their wells. Now, what I have here, Deer Park water. It's great stuff. It says right on the side here, it comes from a protected area in Pennsylvania. I was never very good at chemistry, but this is Morton salt. Comes from Illinois, Ohio, out in the west. They don't even get, we dig it in New York State, but we don't, I don't know how many, does the salt you buy in Rockland County come from New York State, or does it come from South America? Does it? Roadsalt. New York City buys it from South America. Comes in bus loads up the Hudson. There's no particular reason we shouldn't buy it in New York State and keep the money in the country. This is nice, pure, clean water. But what happens to it? Anybody, this cost me, $1, $1.50. A few years ago, people never even thought they'd be buying water. You just go drink it out of your well. Beautiful, clear stuff. Now, EPA says 20 parts per milligrams per liter. Well, that's way more than that. That's probably 200 milligrams per liter. This fellow over here, he had 400 or 500, 600 you just have in your well? 700? By golly. You know, that's what it is. Does anybody want to try this? Does anybody want to drink it? This is what the highway departments and water softeners are doing to our water. There is only two ways to get the salt out of this water. One is reverse osmosis filtration. It's very expensive. It takes about 4 gallons of contaminated water to make 1 gallon of clean water. When you discharge that contaminated water, now it's saltier than ever. You're discharging it back into a septic system for a household, or you evaporate it. You have the natural evaporation process over the ocean. the ocean is salt water, the fresh water evaporates out of it, and you end up with clean water. The only way I can get this clean is when I dump it outside and the sun evaporates the water out of it. You're going to end up leaving the salt right back to where it was. Now, you're talking about recycling the salt water, and they must have to boil it out. That's got to be the only way, or they have a really expensive reverse osmosis filtration. If this gets into my well, are you going to spend $2 or $3 million bringing a pipeline to my house? I mean, you might have to spend a little bit more money on a bigger blade to scrape the roads and some wear-out plates to go on the bottom of the blades. But boy, you can buy a lot of snow plows for $1 million. And once that contamination's in the ground, is the county going to pay to have it cleaned up? If it was a gas station, you had MTBE spill in the ground, the EPA would definitely make you come and clean it up. You can't drink the water after gasoline gets into it, or MTBE gets into it. You can't drink the water after salt gets into it. This is just as bad a chemical as walking outside and dumping gasoline on the ground. So anybody that puts salt on the ground is just as guilty as anybody else with priority 2 chemicals, dumping them in the ground. Now, my doctor told me, stop using this salt on the tomatoes, but he told me, don't stop drinking water. And I don't know how many people can stop drinking water, but if you don't do something about it real soon, you're going to have to stop drinking water. This is New York State's best resource. And underneath Rockland County, always had great water. This is why you have these great wells that you're not pumping out of the Hudson like a lot of the other counties. You have, United Water here has some really high producing wells with great water, but they have 30 milligrams per liter. 10 years, they're going to have 60 milligrams per liter. 30 years, you won't be able to drink the water here. And where are you going to get it from? There are no new aquifers being grown. So please, protect my water.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Mr. Boyd. I think that you made a very dramatic point and an issue that is very serious. And I thank you for your presentation. I think that we all take this issue very seriously. Obviously, the health department does, and the highway department of various towns, as well as the highway department of Rockland County. Obviously, they have been making great attempts to cut back on the use of salt. And I know that my colleagues in the legislature would continue to implore them to cut back even more and find other ways, and hopefully there are other methods, and we can discuss the issue of the calcium, magnesium, and the cost. Perhaps that's something that we can discuss further. Obviously, water softeners, I learned about this evening, and fertilizers, both being contaminants that do impact our wells and increase the level of salt. Mr. Potanovic gave us a story, and as an educator, I can tell you it's always best to make a point and to teach a lesson when you have a story to tell, because that has the greatest impact. And so that's why I'm so pleased that Mr. Potanovic was here tonight to be able to tell us his story. It is very costly to have contaminated wells, very costly in terms of hooking it up to public water or replacing the wells or going through a process of reverse osmosis. As I mentioned earlier, Massachusetts had a serious problem, and it was very, very costly, both first in fiscal issue as well as health issue, clearly. I just wanted to ask any legislators, I know that it's late and we've gone through a presentation. I wanted to ask first if legislators had any questions that they wanted to pose. If not, I want to, Mr. Dusanenko, please use your microphone so that we can hear you.
Just wanted to thank all the presenters for this evening. It's informative, and hopefully we can work together to keep a safe environment, not only safe environment, but also safe roads. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dusanenko. I just wanted to know if there's anyone from the public that wanted to speak, but please could you be brief, because the hour is late. If there was anyone else, I did want to give anybody an opportunity to speak. Obviously not. Good. Before we go, there's just one item of business that I had neglected to do earlier, was if I could ask for a motion to adopt the minutes from the meetings of February 23rd and March 9th, moved by Legislator Berliner, seconded by Legislator Zabrowski. All in favor? All opposed? So moved. Now a motion to adjourn, Legislator Berliner, seconded by Legislator Zabrowski. Thank you all for attending. We are adjourned.